Hello everybody, welcome to this third video in the series on currency rates and DAX and Power BI. If you haven't watched the other two videos, I highly recommend it. This one's going to build on top of those. So you might see some measures in here that I won't explain in this video, and it might be a little confusing. But if you go ahead and check out those other videos, it will clear that up. So this topic is going to deal with what happens in if your currency rates table doesn't have all the days accounted for. Now, depending on your data source, for instance, if you get from like a website, there could be times where there's no rates on Saturday or Sunday or holidays. Now, sometimes that won't be a problem. Other times that could be a problem. So if your business does business on weekends or holidays, you need that currency rate in there in order to be able to fairly compare sales that, say, are in USD in this version, and you convert them to, we'll say, euro. You need to be sure every day has a currency rate so that all sales are accounted for. If you don't, and we'll see this example later, you're comparing apples and oranges. It's going to seem like the euro or whatever you're converting to is going to be lower than what is in USD, and you might just think, oh, that's just the currency. Well, in reality is you're bringing in 95% of the sales and not all of them. It's something that has to be accounted for, and there's multiple ways to account for it. This example we're going to do here is we're going to take the last available currency rate and basically pull it forward to all the missing dates till there's a new rate. So let's show what exactly is happening. So if we go to our table and our fat currency rates table here, I'm showing the euro. This example is just January 2016 and their associated cross rate. So everything looks pretty good, starting off in the first, you go all the way down. But then you hit the 26th and all of a sudden, bam, you're at the 29th. I'm not sure what happened on the 27th and 28th. For this example, I just took out some days, so it's just random, but it could be any sort of reason. Now, it could be a data source problem, and that might be better to handle than Power Query. And we'll show you how to handle this in Power Query in a different example. But for this one, I want to focus on just using DAX. So we need to say for the 27th and the 28th, I want this 0.920 number to be used. Now, it sounds easy in theory, and in traditional Excel, since it's row by row, it's pretty easy actually. It's probably much easier in Excel to do it for that one example. But it's not that hard in DAX. I'm going to show you how to do it. And then, of course, DAX just opens up a whole other world of being able to slice and dice numbers on the fly without having to redo it like you would have to do with traditional Excel. So let's go ahead and just hop right into it and just see what we can do here. So let's go to our main table here. I have a couple things in here already. So if you take a look, we have our dates on the rows from our date table and the currency rate for the euro. Now the currency rate is just simply using a sum. I need to aggregate something. Now, since we're dealing with one currency rate at one day, you can use sum, average, min, whatever you want. The only difference would be what's happening at the total level. So if you take a look at our matrix here, the total level is 26.6983. Makes absolutely no sense. It's literally just summing all the day's currency rates and putting in that total. I'm not going to worry about that total number now because we're going to show you how to iterate over the days to get the correct total figures. But just something to keep in mind that if you write a measure that's not going to be able to handle that at the total level, either take the totals off your table or rewrite the measure so that it does. If not, your users will be very confused on what that number is. Now, since you can't add them up because they're currency rates, so they are what they are in the time, and that's it. So with that in mind, we have the currency rate measure. Now, these are simple measures that I always write because I'll be able to reference them other places, other measures. And for whatever reason, if I need to make a change to these quote-unquote base measures, I can make the change once, and it will flow throughout to wherever they go off to. And it saves me time from having to rewrite the same measure over and over again. And also has the benefit of context transition when you use them as a measure. in different formulas and measures. We'll cover that going on down the road too. But basically, when you use a measure in a formula and it has the brackets around it and it turns purple, it has what they call an implicit calculate wrapped around it, which turns your row context into a filter context. Not gonna worry about that right now. That's not really applicable to this example, but just something to keep in mind, that it's always good to build these base measures and just go off that. So we have a base measure of the currency rate. That's going to be an important one. Now, for me personally, I always make a current date measure, and that brings in whatever date I'm in the current filter context. So like the currency rate table, you can use min, max, whatever. For me, I always use max, because at the grand total level at this 131, that probably does make some more sense, because that is the last day that's in this example. Now most of the time you're not gonna put this measure on your table anyway. It's kind of a way to use in other measures as a reference point to see where you are, quote unquote, are in time. The last currency rate date is just this last date based off the fat currency rates table. No reason to use last date there. You can use max as well. It's the same premise as your current date, but it also just gives you a point in time where you are in relation to the currency rates table. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, again, to put these on your table for end users. They're more reference points. So if you scroll down, we could see here that the 27th, 28th, there's no currency rate for the euro. The current date, 27th and the 28th, and the last currency date is blank. Now, this last reported currency date, now this is going to be the one that drives what rate to use for the missing days. So if you scroll back up, if there's a currency rate, we're just going to use that currency rate, that date that occurred on, because that makes sense. The last reported date is the same as the date you're in. You're golden, nothing to worry about. But when you scroll down here, 26th and the 27th, you need to tell DAX that if we're in the 27th and there's no date, I want the last date that there was a currency rate, and that's the 26th. The same thing that happens on the 28th. So this is not the previous day all the time. You can't assume that the day that's blank, the previous day will have a rate, because this instance we don't. This could be a weekend or an extended holiday, so you can't hard code in there. You should never hard code anything to begin with, that the next the previous date will have the currency rate I want, because what happens when that's blank? So this will always tell you to bring in the last date available. So it's 26, 26, 26. So it's going to repeat itself. And then if you look at the last reported currency rate, you'll see it 9.2 is the last actual date, and this one 9.2, because it pulls in the 26th currency rate. So the question is, how do we get this last reported currency date in there? It's not as complicated as it first might appear. Now, a couple things before we dive into the actual function that you should be trying to think about here is everything happens in a filter context. Where are we in this point in time? If we're in this 127.16 row, we don't want to be there anymore. We want to be in the last time there was a currency rate. So I want to remove this filter on the 27th and say I want to use the 26th. So you try thinking like that. You start thinking, well, how do I remove filters? Well, that's going to be calculate, because calculate and calculate table are the only functions that can modify the filter and change it. Don't get that confused with filter, which can only further restrict data. So if we go into the last reported currency date function, we're going to take a look at it right here. So step one is I always try to define as many variables as I can. Now the important thing to remember is scope though. Variables will take on the value of where they're defined. So if you're going to iterate something with a sumx, a minx, a filter, or whatever, and you define that variable outside of that filter, you're going to get some results that don't make sense, because that you think that variable is going to change when you go into the filter, and it's going to quote unquote hold on to the number or whatever before you got in there. So our example here, current date, that's fine. Current date's not going to change. So was it absolutely necessary to define this variable here? No, not really. But it's just a habit I've gotten into. So I try to just do it from now on. So going through the logic we just talked about, how do I tell DAX to remove the filter that we're on the current date, say the 27th in this example, and give me the 26th? So first things first, we want to filter the all DinDate table. So the all base, more or less in this instance, removes the filters. So we're in here in the 27th in the initial filter context. We're going to tell DAX through this filter all to just get rid of all that. So we basically have the whole DinDate table open up to us, but we need to filter it down to the 26th. So what do? We tell DAX that in this whole date table, we want to go to where the DinDate column with all the actual dates is equal to either the last currency date or the current date. Now, if those two things are not the same, we always want the last currency date, which is why in here we pull in 126, because it's 126 versus 127. So obviously the minimum there is 126. So that's step one. And then we need to take that date and we need to apply it to the currency rate table to get this currency rate. So let's bring up that measure. So here we are. We got some variables defined here. Currency selected. As I mentioned in the other videos, we've had, I think it was something like 10 to 12 different currencies. So we needed to know what currency is currently being evaluated. Now, in this example here, we have it based on a slicer, but I'll show you in a second that it doesn't have to be a slicer. You know, the filters that get sent to DAX, it doesn't matter if it's a slicer, if it's coming from a table, a visual, it doesn't matter. All it matters is that it's a filter. So let's go back to that currency rate. And then we're gonna bring in the last reported date, which is this last reported currency date. I try to not name them all the same so I can't keep them straight in my head so I don't get too confused. And again, you probably didn't need to define these as variables. You could just put the actual measures in this lookup function here. But for me, if I can define a variable, I always will. It's just a good habit to bring in with, again, keeping in mind scope and all that. So this rate variable is we're gonna use a lookup function. We're gonna look up the currency rate cross rate that we want to bring in. So it's that fact table. Now, since we have a lot of currencies in that table, we can't just go off the date. We need to tell it we want the correct currency and the correct date. So the currency ticker equals the currency selected. So in this example, the euro. And then the currency date equals this last reported date, which is in this example, the 26, 26, 26, and then it kicks off to the 29th. So this last reported date ignores the other dates coming from the filter context, the 27th and the 28th, and says, no, I don't want to use those. I want to use the last reported date, which is the 26th. And this is how we get that rate. And then all we do is take this last reported currency rate measure and multiply it by our base measure, which in this time is total sales, but could be anything. So if we put that on there, there's no sales for these dates. So on here, on the 27th and the 28th, we have sales that have been converted to euro. So if we take a look at this measure here, this is not taking in consideration the last reported date. It's just telling me to use the current date. So we put this on the matrix here. What's going to happen here? 27th, 28th, looks like we have no sales. See what I mean here? You got 4 million in sales at the total level here, but only 3.8. This is the same conversion or the same currency rate. So you need to be able to account for these missing data points. Because if you don't, it's going to look like this euro just had a big hit, when in reality, you're missing, 200,000 euros in sales based on just your data model and your data being incomplete. And then a cool thing you can do here is, this is going back to the other video, so feel free to check those out. But you can do a formatted sales. You got your euros in here. So you got your 4.095 euros. And then we can just get rid of, a lot of these are just step-by-step, bricks to the final result. So you don't want to put pretty much any of this on the final table until your formatted sales. So let's just go ahead and get rid of those. And then we can bring in you got euros, pounds, dollars. You can actually get all those in there. Look at that. You got USD, Euro, and British pounds all in one table, all converted correctly. Now I have show items with no data to show the demonstration of what's missing, so you don't want to have those on there. So turn off show items with no data, and we'll get rid of these blanks. So here, then now you have a fair comparison of your USD, Euro, and pounds for the month of January. And you notice these grand totals are correct as well, because I kind of skipped over it. All we're going to do is iterate over the values of the dim date using our correct base measures and our last, correct currency rate. So that goes, basically takes these numbers and just sums them all up to get your total. If you don't use SumX, let's just take that out and see what happens, huh? Your numbers, the USD will make sense because that's just, they're already in US dollar. But without using SumX, your numbers are going to be off here. Because what's going to happen is it's going to take the total euro number and multiply it by the last reported currency rate. And that's not correct. Now, it's close, but we like to be very accurate and very correct with our assessments here. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. There's a couple other videos coming, in the future that will talk about different ways to handle missing data. There's tons of ways you can do this. Some of our future videos will be, always use the start of the month. That whatever the first of the month's currency rate, use that throughout the whole month, or use the last date, or use the actual currency rate if one exists, and if when you hit one that doesn't exist, give me the average of all the currency rates till that date, and then go forward. Or just use the running average of the currency rate for that month. Like, there's so many different ways you can handle this, and I've seen it a bunch of different ways. But I think the last reported makes the most sense, and I think it's the most intuitive, and I think it provides a great baseline. Because much like we built on the first two videos with all these measures and bringing in the correct and all figures and all that, those forthcoming videos I just mentioned will build off this as well. the most important thing is to have the idea of the filter context. How do I overwrite it? How do I bring in whatever the last was? So that's just a quick, well, turning a little bit longer than I was expecting, idea of how to account for different missing data points in your currency rates table. If you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and I would definitely subscribe to this channel. There's a bunch of content coming out from a bunch of great people. A lot of these people, if not most of them, are on the front lines doing this in real life. It's not theoretical. It's not just what's makes the perfect technical sense. It's what's happening in reality. It's what people are using. So I definitely subscribe. I know myself, I've learned tons from other people producing content, and it's a great community. So just go ahead and subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and we'll see you later. Thanks for listening.